What's going on, you perfect specimens of human nature, and welcome back to the Okkii YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about something that's very fundamental to the process of music production, and that is mixing and mastering. At its most basic form, mixing and mastering is intended to optimize a track for the listener's experience. While mixing is more intended to balance the elements within your track, mastering is intended for optimizing your track for distribution and playback on different devices. Basically, we want to make sure that our tracks sound the best for our listeners and that we don't have any competing frequencies that could potentially hurt their ears if they were using either low quality speakers or they were turning up the volume too much. Today I'm going to be showing you a quick, simple, and effective technique that I implement in my own workflow to clear out unwanted sounds and help give me a nudge in the right direction when it comes to preparing for a release. Now, I've gathered all of my information from YouTube itself over the years of researching mixing and mastering, so this is just going to be an accumulation of a bunch of different sources, and I just thought that I should give back to the YouTube community just like they gave to me when I was in need of some information. So this is an unreleased track that I'm currently in the process of preparing for distribution. That being said, it means that I've finished almost all of the creative additions that I'd like to include in this track, and I'd like to start moving forward into optimizing the sound of the track itself to make sure that it sounds the loudest that it could possibly be and it sounds as clear as possible. So before anything, I'm just going to show you a little bit before the drop as well as the first part of the drop so you can have a clear understanding of where we started off. Okay, and while that sounds really good right now for me on my studio monitors, I'm not 100% sure that it's going to sound good for someone listening to it on headphones. I want to make sure that it sounds good for someone listening to it on an iPhone speakers, for example, because that's mostly where people find music or they come across music a lot of the times on social media or on YouTube. So I want to make sure that my track is optimized for all of those different listening platforms as well as different playback devices. Typically, I like to start off by gain staging, and what that means is I'm going to set a target decibel limit for all of the elements within my tracks to hit. In this case specifically, I like to set -18 for most of them, while I set my drums, mainly the kick and snare, for -12 and my bass for -16. It's a little bit harder to explain than it is to show, so I'm just going to show you a rack that I made in Ableton to help me gain stage a lot quicker. As you can see, I have a lot of different elements and I have a lot of different groups. So I have 2 different basses within the track. I have 3 different atmospheric sounds, and it kind of goes on, 2 different bloops, a lot of different vocals over here that you can see. I did some editing, tons of drums and percussion sounds, and all of those sounds can potentially clash, and we really want everything to be audible. Otherwise, I just wasted my time adding all of that stuff if it's just gonna jumble up into one big, muddy, reverb-filled track. And that's what we're trying to prevent here. So the first step is gonna be gain staging. Basically, I'm gonna be going to every single track and throwing on this gain stage audio effect rack. So it basically consists of a utility audio effect and a Voxengo span, which is a free plugin. I'll be linking it down below in the description if you guys want to recreate this exact effect rack. So for the bass, we're just going to solo it and play the bass at its loudest part. So for this one, it'll be right over here. We're just going to loop it and play the bass. So we're hitting -6 decibels, which is not where I want my basses to be. So all I'm going to be doing is lowering the gain knob on the utility audio effect until I reach -16 decibels, which is right around here. Now, this doesn't have to be exact. You don't need to spend hours tweaking to make sure that its exact highest peak hits -16 or -18 or whatever you decide to put your limit at. The main intention is to balance every single element within the track. That way you have a really flat surface to work with when it comes to mixing. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do this to every single element within the track, and we'll get right back to it. So now when moving over to the kick, the snare, and other percussive elements, I'm gonna choose between what I want to pop out more. So in this case, it's gonna be the kick and the snare. I definitely want those hitting really hard. And then everything else, I'm going to gain stage to -16 or potentially -18, depending on how I'm feeling. Now this is sort of like an adaptation towards the common method of gain staging, which is basically putting everything at -18 or whatever decibel limit you might have set to. I'm kind of mixing within the gain staging. It's mainly because I know the sounds that I use and I know exactly what I'm looking for. But if you would prefer to gain stage everything to the same decibel limit, that's definitely up to you, and then you can mix from there. I'm kind of just preemptively mixing during my gain staging phase, which some might consider to be a flaw, but once again, this is just how I'm doing it, and you can judge for yourself in the final result to see if that's something that might work for you or not. Sorry, snare is at 12. The snap is gonna be at 16, -16. Definitely gotta turn it down. Just a quick tip, just something that I've started recently doing in a lot of my pieces of work is I put some background Foley, whether it be little samples from like a city park, a market, or potentially like kids playing or people cheering, and you just put it really, really down, lower than anything you would set on your gain stage. So for that one, for example, I put -24 decibels, and I might even put it a little bit lower, but it just helps to fill out the track, and especially during this time here where we're all kind of stuck at home, that might bring back a familiar feeling, and little textures and things like that help to increase the listener's experience of your music and give off the feeling that you're putting into your track when you're creating it. So we're probably not going to notice a huge difference in the way that our track sounds, other than the fact that almost everything in the track is going to be significantly lower. The big benefits of doing this now is that you're going to have tons of headroom to boost and cut frequencies, as well as raise the volume at the end to achieve the loudest possible mix. Now, loudness isn't 100% everything, but there is somewhat of an industry standard when it comes to the loudness of your track. Obviously, you don't want your track to sound much lower than the track that your audience was listening to previously. That means if your track comes on next, you don't want it to be so much lower that they perceive it to be of bad quality or of unprofessional mixing and mastering. So we're just gonna play the loudest part and see how much headroom we actually have in the track. Okay, so our track is maxing out at about -7.5 decibels. That gives us about 7 decibels to play with of headroom, which is really, really a lot of room to play with, and it's perfect. This is the loudest part of our track, and we have it looped. We're going to continue looping it throughout the process so that we can manipulate the sounds to the way that we like it. So we're just going to go to the master track over here, and I have another audio effect track, Billy's Simple Master. But basically it consists of a couple of audio effects that are stock plugins in Ableton Live. So the first thing we're going to pull up is a compressor. And basically what it's going to do is recognize the frequency that we tell it to focus on and squish the sound down. That way if something passes the threshold and gets too loud, it will squish it so it doesn't hurt anyone's ear or anyone's speakers. We definitely don't want clipping or any sort of distortion to happen. So when your track is at this stage, I would suggest putting the threshold down to around -30 and play with it. You don't want too much compression or else your track is going to sound really thin. So just play with the threshold knob over here. And a beginner's tip, this one got me for a long time. Make sure to unclick the makeup button right over here. Otherwise, the more you put your threshold down, the louder your track is gonna get, and it kind of derails everything else that we're gonna be doing here. That's something that eluded me for a very long time, and I just recently learned that that's what was happening. So we're just gonna turn on the EQ button over here, and what this allows you to do is select the frequency that you would like the compressor to focus on. Meaning, once something within this frequency range, for example, right now of 900, which is around the mid-range, I'd say, if anything passes the threshold of negative 25 decibels, which a lot will at this point, it's going to compress the sound and make it a little bit more easier for speakers to output it, as well as for listeners to listen to it very loud without hurting their ears, which you really want that. So I'm just gonna mess with the frequency knob to see where I want the compression to focus on. So a lot of this is gonna go by ear, so once again, make sure that you're listening to it on a listening device that you're familiar with. So if you have headphones that you listen to a lot of music with, or if you have studio monitors that you usually play music through, I would suggest mixing on that because you're kind of used to how music sounds through it. Okay, so when you're playing around with the compressor, also be sure to mess with the release and the attack. Personally, I wouldn't really touch the ratio because compression ratio, the 2-to-1 compression ratio is fairly good for most genres of music, so I don't really mess with that. When you play with the attack, that's going to affect how clicky some of the sounds are going to be. So for example, if I put some focus on the lower end and I turn the attack down from anywhere from about like 9 to I think 20, there was someone who had mentioned that was like the perfect range to get kind of a clicky sound out of your kick. So we can even test that out now. I don't really want too much compression on this track. I think that a lot of the emotions that are coming out of this are better expressed in a very wide and full environment. So we're gonna kind of tone down the threshold a little bit more. Once again, it's all gonna be subjective and it's all gonna be very, very specific to your track. So the settings that I end up using on my compressor will not 100% translate well onto your track, but the concept is definitely there. You want to mess with the attack to get that clicky sound, or if you go a little bit past 30, maybe even 40 milliseconds, you will find that you have like a fuller and thicker sound, which is definitely what I'm personally going after. So I'll probably keep it around 28, 30. And the release over here is... Yeah, I don't know what the release does, really. Okay, so I'm really liking where that's sounding. I have the release currently at around 30. I have the attack currently at around 28, which supposedly is supposed to give me a nice full sound, and I have the threshold at negative 19. I did boost the audio a little bit by 2 decibels, but you'll even see here we only maxed out at negative 6 decibels, meaning we still have 6 decibels to play with of headroom, and that's really good because we have a lot more to do. So now we're going to focus a little bit more on the frequency boosting and subtracting within your track. Basically, when you're putting a lot of audio effects and you have a lot of different audio in general in your track, you're gonna get certain frequency ranges where sound tends to collect. Now, mainly in the mid-range as well as somewhere over here around 3K, there are some pretty terrible sounds, and I will show you using the sweeping method. But first things first, we're actually gonna grab a utility. So if you go to audio instruments and you type in utility, you can just double click on this and the utility audio effect will pop up. And when you turn it on, just turn on the mono button over here, and this is gonna allow us to master everything in mono. So that means that we're gonna be mastering for the people who are using phone speakers, we're gonna be mastering for the people who are going to be using little Bluetooth speakers that are just one speaker, or a TV, for example, or even laptop speakers. We wanna make sure that they have a good experience just hearing your track in general, and sometimes problems expose themselves in mono that you might not have heard if you were just listening to your track in stereo. So we're gonna turn everything on in mono and turn our EQ 8 on. And if you don't know, all you have to do, once again, and this will be the common theme, you just search it in your audio effects, EQ 8, and you double click on that, and it should pop up over here. So I have everything selected so that when I listen to a certain frequency range, it mutes everything else. And we're just going to sweep around and see where there is some really nasty sounds. Let me reset this first.
Just a moment. Is there something else I can help?
The fuck, Siri? So we're just gonna be cutting anything under 20 hertz straight away because that's an audio range that the human ear cannot hear. So I'm just gonna type 20 to be precise, and we're gonna do a ×4 hard cut. So we're just gonna start sweeping back and forth throughout the track and listen for what we call muddiness. Basically, muddiness is what you can only describe as an accumulation of sounds that when they get put together, they sound like whales screaming in the middle of the ocean. It really is not a very pleasant sound, and typically they will kind of accumulate around this range over here. So we're just gonna play the track, and we're gonna make sure to have everything soloed over here so that we're only hearing the frequency range that we're sweeping through. So let's just play the track and start doing it. So that's what you call muddiness, and you'll find a lot of different points within your track where your sounds are accumulating. So you just want to sweep through them, put the Q at about 1.4, something a little bit skinnier, and then once you've found that range where you want to cut down, you're just going to drag the gain a little bit down. You don't want to be deducting too much from the track. I would say -2. I work with 2s. Personally, that's just how I can make sure that everything at the end is still a 0, but we're just gonna be cutting some frequencies by 2 and boosting other pleasant frequencies by 2. This way we can even everything out. So now that we've cut that range by 2, we can actually boost a little bit of the bass by 2, which is something that we wanna have in the track. And I'm also gonna go ahead and search somewhere around the 3000 range for some other unpleasant sounds. You also can't hear anything over 19 kilohertz, I believe. So I would probably cut anything after that frequency as well. So let's just do a quick comparison with and without the EQ8. And keep in mind, we're listening to all of this in mono right now, so it might sound completely different when we go into stereo. But for now, we're gonna focus on the mono. Okay, so right away I can tell that first of all, our bass is nicely boosted cleanly, so we can hear the kick and the bass kicking at the same time. There's no distortion from what I can tell, and I can more audibly hear some of the percussive pieces, mainly because we cut down on number 3 and number 4 over here, which are typical ranges for muddiness to pop up. Especially in this range here, by the way, this is where the ear piercing stuff happens. So you really want to make sure to cut if you can. Cut something, because there is something in there that's going to hurt your ears, as I'm sure you saw that look on my face. Around where we put number 5, which is at the mid-range, 700 hertz, there's the snare and a couple of the percussive elements that we like to see within the track. So I boosted that by about 1.6. I could go to 2. Fuck it. We'll go to 2. We'll keep it there. And now we're going to focus on the side mode. Oh yeah, key thing to note is make sure that your mode on your EQ is an M/S. That stands for mono/side mode, which is probably why I wasn't hearing too much of a crazy difference, although I did see some. But let's see how it is now in the mono mode. You really don't want to be boosting and cutting everything super hard. Once again, it's just kind of like a rough draft, I guess you could say. Now let's listen to everything in sides only mode. What we're gonna do is search up sides, click on the drop down arrow, and you have the option to put a sides only mode. What this is gonna allow you to do is hear all the side information in your track. So that's a lot of the stereo / the things that you have panned left and right. So if you click this, make sure to unclick your mono audio effect over here, and you can click on the M here and it'll quickly switch to an S, and you can get some side information. So as a rule of thumb, you want your kick and your bass to be as mono compatible as possible, because those are better off existing in the mono of your track. While everything else, the higher the frequency gets, exist a little bit better in your side ears, and that's why you typically pan them to the left and right. So when it comes to your side mode, it's actually not the worst idea to cut a decent amount of the low end. Do keep in mind though, the low end within your side information will also give warmth to your track. So you don't want to cut too much of it. That's why I actually took off the solo. I just kind of sweeped left and right to see where I was comfortable cutting off without losing that warmth that this track so easily exemplifies. Okay, so we've managed to clean up the track a little bit. We've boosted and cut multiple frequencies, nothing too extreme. Like I said, my personal rule of thumb is -2, +2. So if you subtract 2 from a certain frequency, then you can boost +2 on a different frequency, kind of like I did here in the mono mode. I cut to around the 420 hertz range, which allowed me to boost a little bit more in the 53 hertz range, which for me was my bass and my kick. Both of those sounds existed within that frequency range, and I just boosted it by 2, maybe 2.3, because I'm a little bit of a bass head, so I really want that bass to hit super hard. And make sure to keep in mind, it's always a good idea to just cut the unnecessary frequencies that you don't need in your track, because while you can't necessarily hear it, your track can get muddy because of it, and it also takes processing power that doesn't really need to be put towards those sounds. So the final thing we're going to be doing is we're actually going to be putting 2 different limiters. Now I'll link the YouTube video that I got this trick from, maybe down in the bio, because it's a really nice in-depth tutorial on how to do this mixing rack. It has a couple of other different features that I personally didn't feel were necessary for my type of mixing and mastering, but I definitely loved this double limiter idea. So basically right now we have about 4 decibels to play with over here. We maxed out at -3. Basically this is just going to be used for raising the volume back up to 0 decibels. We are not going to actually be using this to limit anything at all right now. All we're going to do is raise the volume, and this is going to be a really good marker for us if we do end up clipping on any of the sounds, because when you put the look ahead at 1.5 milliseconds, you're going to get some audible distortion. Quickly going to let you know that something's wrong with your mix, and you can go back and overlook it. Once again, for more explanation on this one, I will be linking that video down below to a more in-depth mixing and mastering tutorial. So we're just going to start at 0 and raise the volume until we see that the limiter is working, and then we'll tone it back so that at no point throughout this track this limiter here is doing anything other than raising our volume. Okay, so at 4.4 decibel gain, we noticed that the limiter was doing some work. So we just toned it back a little bit, and we're making sure that nothing is gonna activate this limiter here specifically. And then we're actually gonna turn on our second limiter, and this is where the cool thing happens. So we're gonna put 3 millisecond look ahead on that one, so we're not gonna get too much audible distortion. But this is also another cool trick that I got from that video, and I really wanted to put this in there, is that there's 2 different types of decibel information that you're gonna be receiving. There's gonna be it's like a lighter green and a deeper green one. So you see that difference over there? There was kind of like a darker, like a very light green, and then there was like a very vibrant green. Basically what we're trying to do is get that vibrant green all the way up to around the 6 decibel range. But yeah, we're gonna be raising the gain all the way up until we sort of see that the more vibrant green is up around the 6 decibel range, because that is the meat and potatoes of your track. Make sure to save your fucking project, because that would really suck if you did all this work and nothing came out of it. So both limiters received about an increase of 4 decibels. Altogether, we increased the track by about 8 decibels, which, if you recall originally, when I showed you how much we were maxing out just after the gain staging process, we did have 8 decibels of headroom to play with, which was perfect. We did a little bit of compression, a little bit of EQ kind of frequency boosting and cutting. And I like to believe that the track sounds a lot better because of it. We're gonna play the drop without this little mastering chain, so I just turned everything off right now, and then I'm gonna turn it on and we'll go for another round and see how we did, I guess. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with playing around a little bit more on your frequencies. Maybe you heard something that you didn't like. Maybe you wanted to give the kick a little bit more oomph. You saw that I just added an extra cut in this range over here, which is something that I had sort of swept through before, but then removed. The main goal is to really get a understanding of the way that mixing and mastering works, as well as understand why people do it and what the thought process behind there. And really, it's those nasty muddy ass sounds, as well as making sure that our track is nice and loud. I just want to say thank you so fucking much if you stayed to the end of this video. If you felt that you might have learned something, then please consider giving me a like or even subscribing. I'm going to be posting every single day, or well, what? I'm going to be posting once a week until things start to pick up or until there's a little bit more demand. But as always, have a beautiful fucking day. My name is Okkii, and peace out.